Greetings and welcome to today's webinar on changing the dynamics and advancing a just green trade and industrial transition. I'm Sara Pantulian, I'm the Chief Executive of ODI, and we're really delighted to be hosting this timely event in partnership with the Trade Negotiations and Investment Forum, TNIF, the Nelson Mandela School at the University of Cape Town, and the Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA, in Brazil. The global push towards greener production and trade is actually raising some critical questions about fairness, about equity, about the potential for unintended consequences. How can we ensure that low and middle income countries are not left behind in this transition? Well, that's what we want to explore with this webinar, really discuss the challenges and the opportunities of greening production, of greening trade and industrial development, particularly from an African perspective. So with South Africa's upcoming G20 chairmanship or chairing, we want to focus on how to reshape current dynamics, how to advance a more equitable green trade agenda. So today we've gathered a really distinguished panel of experts who will delve into the diverse viewpoints that there are within the G20 on trade, on investment, on industrial policies in relation to environmental sustainability as well as climate justice. I'm really delighted to welcome our speakers here today, beginning with Her Excellency Ambassador Amina Mohammed. Amina is the founder and chairperson of Trade Negotiations and Investment Forum, and she was previously a cabinet secretary and minister across different portfolios for the government of Kenya. She was also an ambassador and permanent representative to the UN and the WTO. Welcome, Amina. I'm also delighted to be joined by Professor Faisal Ismail, long-standing partner of ODI, director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. Faisal was an ambassador and permanent representative of South Africa to the WTO, and is also been a special envoy of South Africa-USA AGOA negotiations. Amin and Faisal will focus on the African perspectives for the engagement of the G20 on advancing a just green trade industrial transition. And I'm really grateful to both of them for taking time out to join us because they're very busy and it's really precious to have their perspectives. We'll then proceed to hear from our colleagues at the Institute of Applied Economic Research in Brazil, who are part of the T20 Organizing Committee in Brazil, which is the G20 engagement group that brings together think tanks and research center from G20 members. We're joined by Fabio Vera Soares, who is the Director of International Studies at IPEA, and Fernando José Ribeiro, who is the Coordinator of International Trade Studies. We'll hear from both of them regarding the T20 process, how this process has facilitated interactions with G20 members, and also, some of the specific findings so far. And finally, our own Jody Keane, Senior Research Fellow at ODI, will provide a final intervention on, some of the aspects of what it's been termed the green squeeze. We'll discuss certain aspects of the green squeeze and how they could be taken up by the South African presidency of the G20. I'll give 5-6 minutes to each speaker for some initial remarks, and then I will open the floor for questions and really a broader interactive discussion between the panelists and the audience, and then I'll finish with some further reflections from the panel. I want to stress that this is an interactive session, so I really want to encourage all of you to actively participate, share your thoughts, ask questions. During the session, you can use the chat at the bottom of your Zoom link or the Q&A function and really contribute your thoughts and expertise. Your diverse perspectives are really crucial to shaping this important conversation. You can also join the conversation online and share questions and ideas about the event on social media, tagging us at ODI_trade and ODI_global. But without further delay, let's get into the discussion. Amina, let me start with you. We're really eager to hear your insights on the African perspective on the G20. How can Africa effectively engage on the issues arising from the global policy fragmentation in the context of green trade?
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. So let me first of all thank you for organizing this webinar, and tell you that I'm so delighted to be able to see Faisal after so many years. Faisal, it's wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to see everybody who's here. I think that after this, Faisal, we cannot lose contact again. But let me say this, that Faisal was an engine, of just moving African positions forward when we were at the WTO. And I think all of us remember him very, very kindly. I think he may have forgotten about us, but we all remember him very fondly. So really, great topic, great topic. I think that many challenges that face I think all of us when it comes to the green transition, green trade, and the global policy fragmentation that you have actually spoken to. And this is my conviction that together, if we actually work together in good faith and pulling in the same direction, we will be able to confront the challenges that are rising, from the transition that has begun and is continuing, obviously faster in some regions than others. We must confront these challenges together. We also take note of the increased unilateral measures that are being put in place. As we confront these challenges, I think we must do that in a manner that allows all of us to embrace the new opportunities that present themselves. So let me first begin by telling you what I observed at the WTO Public Forum, because I was lucky enough to go to the Public Forum this year. I hadn't done this for a number of years, I think, since we left Geneva. And this happened last week. And I think it provided all of us as stakeholders an opportunity not only to celebrate 30 years of the existence of the multilateral trading system, but also to just be together to discuss all these new issues that were coming up, all the challenges around these issues, and to see whether we could together work on dealing with the challenges, but also embracing the opportunities. But what really struck many of us and me, fundamentally, was the issues that were arising out of the different approaches of G20 members in addressing climate. Those differences were so palpable, they were so clear and inescapable, I think, to many of us that were present. But what also many of the discussions highlighted, after noticing these major differences and major gaps that exist, is that, and this was including the panels that we participated in as a team from TNIF, but I know that ODI was also present in Geneva. And what was highlighted was that how the coordination of the combination of approaches across G20 members could actually, within a very meaningful time frame, provide an unprecedented boost to Africa's trade and development. So what was lacking was coherence, basically. There were all these measures, thrown all around the place, everybody embracing a different set of measures. And that thread that should have, somehow joined these measures, or at least gone through these measures, pulling some of them together, was completely absent, but is clearly needed. And I want to look at this in two ways, and I'll try and be really brief as I move forward. First, that when it came to the critical minerals that are needed, for the technological advances that are taking place, and where you find many big players trying to secure African supply, what we saw was that there was much more readiness actually to engage with Africa than there was ever before. And for me, it was like a dim glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. There was a formulation or adoption of soft law approaches, and these were actually discussed. There were commitments to support African value chain development, in the case of the US, for instance, and economic corridors in the case of the EU. In our conversations, there was one plank that was missing, and we all of us try to encourage the others that had not told us clearly what they were doing in terms of engaging Africa on the development of value chains of critical minerals. We encouraged them to come on board and said that this train of value addition may leave the station without them if they're not able to come on board, because they also need these critical minerals for their own technological development. And what we realized was that if all these new processes that we're engaging in, that we're discussing, could continue without the undue interference from commercial interests, from geopolitical insecurity interests, actually Africa may be able to push and reduce reliance on some key partners, a reliance that has not proved to be as supportive of Africa's development of its value chains as was expected initially. And what came out clearly, and I think the underlying understanding was Africa needs investment, that Africa needs infrastructural development, that Africa needs processing capabilities, that we need policy frameworks to support related value chain development. And it needs all hands on deck. It needs all its partners to engage across the board. And I think that's where one of our biggest partners, that's China, comes in. We see China as part of the solution, and we see it as part of the basket of partners that must help move the needle. China will be key, for instance, in boosting the battery value chain across the continent. It will also be clearly important in developing infrastructure. It has already shown its capacity in that area, but also as a market for African commodities, and obviously African critical minerals. And all this is urgent. And one of the things that was being said by all Africans that were there is, look, Africa is open for investment. Africa is open for business, but not on the terms of yesterday. That we are open for business, but we need to engage. We need to engage to develop a different kind of playing field. Yeah, it may not be completely level, but it will be a different, qualitatively type of playground that we should be using, and of course developing different rules of the game. I don't think that Africa intends to play favorites, by the way. In my discussions in Geneva, but also in my discussions elsewhere, it comes out clearly that no, we don't want to play favorites, because that's not in our interest. And for many years since independence, we have played that game and are still not getting to where we should be getting, right? And so we're not going to play favorites. We desperately need development. We desperately need to develop sustainably. We definitely need to create the jobs for our 75% youthful population. And we think that there is enough for everybody to do. There's enough for everybody to get involved in. And our key priority right now is to recognize where and how different G20 members are positioned on the climate trade nexus, and what new entry points there are for Africa to engage. So that was the first one. The second one was that although we know that there are tremendous untapped opportunities in renewable energy, we also know that not many countries are able to find the resources to actually embark on that journey. We are different. We started a long time ago in Kenya. 2/3 of our energy is basically renewable. And so we started in the 70s and 80s. Yeah, a long time before it became trendy to go green. It became renewable energy was just a term that was being, that was out, but was not being embraced. It wasn't being looked at favorably. But we decided that since we're not an oil producing country, since we are not a gas producing country, that we needed to embrace this notion of using our God-given, natural resources, geothermal, solar, wind, hydro, to develop our energy resources, and I think that we did that. What was for us not attractive was that although we'd embarked on this journey, and although we're putting a lot of resources into developing our renewable energy resources, there was no acknowledgement globally. There was no recognition of what we were doing. There was no reward for what we were doing. Though nobody was talking about Kenya's, transition to green energy. And so what happened was that within our neighborhood, we talked about renewable energy until the cows came home. But nobody was interested because they couldn't see the benefits that were deriving from the international community that was talking green now, right? But was not ready to acknowledge that some countries had done really well and that they needed much more support than anybody else, and they needed to become the models, right? Models for others to be able to move in the same direction. Regardless of that, we're able to encourage countries around us. I think Ethiopia was one, Djibouti was the other, South Sudan was another one, to embrace geothermal because we knew that we were all, able to actually exploit and develop that. One of the things I think that I'll bring out before I leave is that what I talked about before, a myriad of approaches, myriad of standards, coherence sacrificed, clarity lost on universal applicability of any of the actions that have been undertaken and any of the measures that have been adopted in different countries or different groups of countries. And therefore it becomes really difficult for countries like ours for example, to prove our low carbon competitiveness. How do you do that? Because there's so many different standards all over the place. We don't have a common acceptable standard on carbon accounting. We risk a real proliferation of approaches that will raise costs for all of us, because you'll be trying to meet all of them at almost the same time.
I want to bring in the others. We'll carry on discussing this point for the rest of the webinars, if I can.
And not accepted, yes, and not accepted by others. So, you asked what specific. The other question was about the G20. I know that Faisal will talk to that, and others will talk to it. But let me just say this: that already, even before we talk about what the G20 meeting in South Africa is all about. One of the things that has happened already is that the African group in Geneva, together with the G20 members, during the Abu Dhabi WTO conference, already called for a ministerial declaration on the contribution of the MTS to tackle environmental challenges. And I think that will be part of the journey of developing this coherence within the standards. But again, as with many things on WTO, although this is a very, very welcome move on an issue of global importance, there are many, many mixed views on it. And I don't think that there is real engagement, as yet on that. So we need greater sensitization, we need greater conversations, we need greater discussions on why we should discuss this at the WTO, also because it is a trade and development issue, and why all of us, including G20 countries, must engage. I think I'll stop there for the moment. I'd be happy to come and talk about all the other questions that were posed to me.
We'll definitely have time to engage with the whole audience, but you're raising some really important points. So, the need, as you said, to really achieve a more coordinated and collective voice if Africa wants to influence the G20 discussion, to get to value addition, to, as you said, try and get a more level playing field, if it's not a fully level playing field, to be able to also navigate on this myriad of standards that are being put out there without clarity on how countries can engage with them. Faisal, you have a very extensive experience of chairing T20 programs. How can South Africa leverage the G20 platform, to address this new protectionism in value chains and ensure this fairer green trade transition?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for organizing this really amazing panel, and also for inviting my sister, Amina Mohammed. I haven't forgotten you at all. We worked very closely together on many difficult challenges. And I recall at least two on the development challenge, how to mainstream development in the WTO, and special and differential treatment, and of course on TRIPS and public health, which is about how to create more flexibility in the rules to create more access to vital medicines for public health. So I agree entirely really with everything that Amina Mohammed has just said, especially that the G20 provides Africa with the great opportunity to focus on the issues that are of critical importance to the continent. The next G20 is on African soil, and it will be an African G20. So it has to focus on the crisis, perhaps the greatest crisis that humanity faces, and that's the climate crisis. Now, on this particular question, Africa, again, is on the back foot. So the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that while Africa has contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, it is bearing already the greatest burden of it. Yet, African countries are committed to make their contribution towards addressing climate change, to decarbonize, and to work with everyone else towards the target of net zero emissions. However, African countries face significant development challenges that are interwoven with climate change and are inextricably connected to development of the African continent. And it is also true that there is an inextricable relationship between the pathways that we need to address our challenges on climate and development, and the need to address global inequities, imbalances, and asymmetries of the global economy. The greatest challenge, perhaps, that the continent faces in its path to develop is to build its productive capacity, to transform its economies, to add value to its abundant resources and commodities by developing inclusive and sustainable industrialization and development. This is why the G20 is very important for Africa, because in the G20 are the biggest economies, both in the North and in the South. And together, we could collectively address these asymmetries and imbalances. Now, I want to just point to at least three of them that will need to be addressed by the G20. The asymmetries on trade and investment, the need to address high levels of protection, and the lack of policy space for developing countries. Second, the need to create greater access to technology and to address the issue of intellectual property rights. And thirdly, the need for access to finance for the poorest countries of the African continent, of the world. On these issues, we need to address the rules of the game to make them fair, to make them more balanced, to make them more socially just and development oriented. Now, I must say I was very pleased last year in September to listen to the president of Kenya, President Ruto, when he made a sterling speech really pointing to the challenges that Africa confronts and that is exacerbated by climate change. He pointed to the fact that climate change is already costing Africa about 5 to 15% of the GDP of individual countries. Poverty in Africa, in many countries, is causing deforestation and biodiversity loss. He pointed to the fact that these crises are causing a debt spiral in several African countries that have already been debt distressed. And he pointed out that the inequitable financial architecture makes it more challenging for African countries because they have to pay at least 5 times more for development finance than other countries in the North. And he also pointed to the fact that we need to structurally transform our economies from being dependent on commodities and for reaping the lowest share of value added from all our commodities. So I think that these are the issues which must be front and center at this next G20, which will be on African soil. And I think that the issues that my sister Amina Mohammed raised about the transition, this great transition that we are witnessing, that transition towards a greener world, which is simultaneously going through a revolution and an industrial revolution in the digital space, is one which has created an increasing tension between the major powers in the North and the South, United States and China. And I agree with Ambassador Amina Mohammed that this new geoeconomic and geopolitical tension provides both challenges and opportunities for Africa. Africa should focus on its own objectives, which is to add value to her minerals, to industrialize, and to transform her economies, and should engage with both the United States and China and all other countries so that it is able to harness the resources and leverage the resources of everyone to advance its objectives. The strategic objectives of the African continent today must be to harness and leverage the resource, the capacity of the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Area to advance the project of building a developmental and inclusive integration process, but to also mainstream climate change, which will address both mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, and which is what I call climate resilient development. And all these issues can be discussed in the context of G20. So I propose that as we go forward, we begin to engage with the G20 members, drawing on the excellent work that was done in Brazil, and before that in India, and before that in Indonesia. All these countries who have similar characteristics, being commodity dependent, also being challenged by the need to transition to renewable energy and to transform their economies. And Africa can learn a great deal from our southern neighbors, but we need our northern partners too to assist with the process of succeeding in this transition towards both a more climate resilient world, but also a more just and socially just and development oriented world. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Faisal. You couldn't have been clearer about, what the pathway should be. And as you said, it really follows from what India and Brazil have done with the G20, with their sort of leadership over the G20, which is a perfect segue for me to go to Fabio and Fernando to really hear your reflections on the T20, G20 process in Brazil and really help us understand the key implications of the Brazil G20 presidency for South Africa, for the African continent, in terms of advancing a just green transition. I mean, in particular, what do you think have been the main areas of convergence, but also the main controversies amongst the G20, and how has the T20 process helped in terms of facilitating these interactions, and also perhaps share what you think are the main findings, the main recommendations that have arisen regarding sustainable development and just transition, and what South Africa should do looking ahead. Fabio, perhaps I'll start with you, and then Fernando can add.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Ambassador Mina. Thank you, Professor Faisal. That was very interesting. So let me explain a little bit what's the T20 about. So the T20 is the engagement group of the think tanks. It has been set up, it initiated in 2012 in Mexico during the Mexico presidency. And since then, it has specialized in bringing together think tanks from all over the world, well beyond the G20 countries or the G20 membership. Today, we have been asked to reflect a little bit on the work that the Trade and Investment Working Group has been doing. And I'm going to look back at the India presidency just to see how the priorities and recommendations and deliverables of the India presidency was taken by Brazil, and then reflect a little bit how these priorities can be taken by South Africa and actually for the African presidency as it has been portrayed. That's pretty much a tradition of the G20, because let's remember, G20 doesn't have a secretariat. So each presidency is responsible to define the priorities in connection with the Troika, so the previous presidency and the next one. So it's a very loose process. And one of the importance, I think, of the engagement groups, and particularly of the G20, is to keep the memory. To go to the G20 leaders and say, look, what do you promise and what you have delivered so far in the different fora? So let's remember that's a forum for cooperation. So there is no decision, there's nothing that's implemented by the G20 itself, but actually that's recommended by them to other international organizations to implement, or that they commit to do themselves with no obligation. So having said that, if we look at the Delhi Leaders Declaration, we are going to see that trade in the very beginning of the declaration, the section on strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. So trade is actually seen within the G20 as engine for growth, and actually as something quite important for poverty reduction. And that's something that struck very well with the Brazil's priority, or at least its presidential priorities. In terms of the recommendations or the commitments that have been put forward in the declaration, we can see it always comes. So the commitment to strengthen WTO as the main forum for the negotiation, to have a well-functioning trade and investment agreements and the dispute settlements working very well, something that we haven't seen and something that was expected to be seen in 2024. And that's something that we basically are going to see repeated probably in the Leaders' Declaration here in Brazil, but without much effects. So the other priority that we saw in India that may be retaken in Africa and hasn't been well developed in Brazil, I must say, is to recognize the challenge of the micro and small and medium enterprise to engage with trade. So in the case of India, we had one of the deliverables was the Jaipur call for action to enhance participation of micro, small, medium enterprises in trade and building their capacity. The second deliverable that we had was the G20 generic framework for mapping global value chains and to identify risks and how to build resilience. So that was pretty much one of the hot topics that we had at the time with the problems with the global value chains. It started with the COVID-19, then we had the war in Ukraine, and then we had the unilateral measures that have been taken. So the discussion around the friendshoring that actually led the T20 Brazil to have a specific discussion on the whole issue of neo-protectionism. The other aspect that has been quite highlighted in India was the digitalization of trade documents. So that was something that they came out with high-level principles. And finally, a declaration that actually came from the outcome documents and the chair summary in the ministerial meeting of the trade and investment ministers around the issue that the trade and environment should be mutually supportive. It's important to say that we didn't have a ministerial declaration in India. It's not foreseen to have one in Brazil. But the difference here is that we are having ministerial declaration for other working groups. That's a clear sign that in terms of trade investments, the multilateral discussion, and even within the G20, is quite difficult. It's quite difficult to come out with a consensus. The other point I would like to highlight is the fact that in that outcome document and just summary that we had from India, there was, again, this recall that environment and trade policies should be mutually supportive. And then the commitment of the essential role of multilateral cooperation to address the issue and the interconnections about them. And then the countries, the G20 members, they said, we will engage in further discussion on trade and sustainability. And actually, it is interesting to see because that's actually the priority number one of the Trade and Investment Working Group in the G20 Brazil. That's precisely trade and sustainable developments. And G20 Brazil wants to have as its key deliverable a key set of principles that are currently being negotiated within this working group that should guide the national policies so that it wouldn't have negative impacts on trade development. So that's actually the challenge that they are facing now in the G20 Brazil, is to come out with these recommendations that would work as a guidance for the G20 member countries and that could be taken forward in other forums, in other negotiations. There are other priorities around this issue. I would like to, one is women in international trade. The other one is, of course, the WTO reform and strengthen the multilateral system. But one that links quite well to what the Ambassador Mina said and to what Faisal said is the issue of sustainable development in investment agreements and the role of FDI in supporting low middle-income countries and even upper middle-income countries and low-income countries in doing the transition, doing value addition, and reaching the sustainable development goals. So I think that's one of the deliverables that we should pay attention on, the experience and the best practice and the forging experience that the G20 countries may have in that field, and how this experience can facilitate cooperation and then just and fair transition, particularly in the energy sector. And here I would like to highlight one thing that I feel it's missing when we talk about the North and the South discussion, is the whole issue of biofuels. So I've been a lot discussing with our African counterparts, and we see a lot about critical minerals and how it's important for the transition, but we're missing the biofuels. That one of the priorities, actually, that we had the launching of the Alliance for Biofuels in India, in the summits. Brazil, I don't need to highlight that, is very key on that discussion, and we are not seeing that discussion in Africa. Perhaps here we have a glimpse that the Global North is sort of leading these debates. Finally, going to the T20, and Fernando is going to highlight some of the recommendations. I would just like to say that we had a task force dedicated to trade investments with 6 subtopics, but more than 50% of the policy briefs that we have received were around trade and investment and climate action, and around dealing with neoprotectionism in a changing futures of the global value chains. Just to give a highlight on how the 2 topics that have been discussed in this webinar were quite taken by the academic and the think tanks to make some proposals. So I pass the word back to Sarah and to Fernando to come out with the recommendations.
Perfect, yeah, Fernando, very, very keen to hear the recommendations.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for ODI for organizing the webinar. Sarah, Jody, also Ambassador Amina, Professor Faisal. It's a pleasure to be here. We are happy to see that in the T20 process, the issues of sustainable development, just transitions, and their relation to trade rules and global governance took center stage. And according to the discussions undertaken by the T20 and the findings of many of the policy briefs prepared and accepted, we can see that the main challenge currently faced by developing countries relating to tackling climate change and promoting just transitions, and reconciling trade with sustainable development, and also the important issue of using trade as a tool for promoting more sustainable productive practice. And all this can be separated or organized in three main issues. The first one is the issue of trade rules and practices. This issue was treated especially by Task Force 4. And we see that we are intensifying rising trade conflicts and unilateralism, the weakening of the World Trade Organization, what's especially negative for least developed countries, a surge on national, regional policy measures that affect trade, ones that justified not only by global environmental concerns, but also national security, strategic industrial targeting, the desire to neutralize import dependencies, but policies that are creating clearly trade distorting rules and that are inconsistent with the WTO. And also the implying regulatory standards that made it hard to comply with, especially for developing country exporters, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, and measures that do not consider the basic idea of the common but differentiated responsibilities in environmental commitments. And also many measures specifically related to agricultural sector and food, bans, taxes, quotas, and other distorting measures like subsidies. So the recommendations for the G20 are very clear. First, support the WTO as the main multilateral forum for negotiations and for enforcing and monitoring of the policies. The other is for the G20 to deal and to discuss the challenges of balancing trade, environment, and climate policies, avoid the simple solution of just exporting regulatory standards or imposing sanctions on non-compliant countries. In agriculture trade especially, strike a balance between measures to tackle climate change and expansion of agricultural production. That's one thing that's very important for the food security. And act through the WTO framework that ensure that sustainability standards are not being created as neo-protectionist measures with neo-protectionist purposes, and for the countries to cooperate and to exercise containment to resist the temptation of creating unilateral environmental regulations that affect the trade, something that could create a noodle ball that tends to restrict trade flows, and also to avoid the idea of the green squeeze, something that Dodi will talk about more next. The second issue is the issue of capacities on developing countries. I think that's common ground that developing countries often lack the adequate resources. And so you can talk about financial resources, human resources, institutional organizations, and technological capacities to design and implement the sustainable long-term transition plans. There are financial barriers to access the environmentally sound technologies and to adapt them to national specific necessities. And we must see and must identify that the usage of unsustainable practice from many least developed countries is not a choice, but survival, because there's no accessible alternative. And so these alternatives must be made accessible. So the recommendations is to develop to support the least developed countries on building the institutional capacity for designing the transition plans, increase South-South and North-South cooperation for the transfer of existing technologies and the development of new technologies, and also developing grants-based and highly concessional finance mechanisms to fund such plans with criteria that prioritize vulnerable and low-income countries. And the third issue is the multilateralism and global governance. We are passing through a global transition toward a more multipolar system with many tensions and overlapping and cascade political, economic, and social tensions, and combined with climate change and the other problems that we are going through. And the weakening of multilateral institutions. We see many countries recurring to national or regional policies with few or no consideration to the possible negative effects on less developed ones, and also for multilateral rules, and the financing gap for transitions. So the recommendations, first, the G20 tried to advocate for urgent reforms to multilateral institutions, from the United Nations to the WTO and the other important ones, especially reform that incorporates the perspectives from the global south. And here, Africa is naturally very important in a key player in all these discussions, in all this framework. Advance a comprehensive reform agenda for international financial institutions, for especially considering the issue of sustainable finance, champion the equitable, sustainable carbon and biodiversity markets and the payment for ecosystem services, one thing that could be very important for the financing solutions for developing countries, and establish commitments that respect the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. That's a pillar of the concept of the just transition. So I think these recommendations establish a clear recommendations and findings establish a clear agenda to be put ahead by South Africa next year on the G20 presidency, and an agenda that developing countries in South Africa should work on this, to these issues to be really internalized by the G20 for many years to come, to work in this group for finding common ground and common solutions for these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. I see that the questions are starting to arrive, so I want to really open up to the audience. But let me first bring in Jody. You mentioned the green squeeze. That's something Jody has been writing a lot about and analyzing. We recently recorded a podcast, our flagship podcast, Think Change, together with Faisal, actually. Perhaps our comms colleagues can put the link in the chat for those who may have not had the opportunity to listen to the podcast. But Jody, without people having to go and listen to the podcast, can you explain from your perspective, what aspects of the green squeeze are gaining most traction under the South African G20 presidency?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Zara, and thank you all of our distinguished panelists here for joining us. We've engaged with all of you in different ways on this concept of a green squeeze. So I'm really pleased that we can talk about it today, but also kind of change some of the language as well, so that we start thinking about a kind of green ease. And this is a term that some of my colleagues are kind of working with at the moment as we try to turn this into a more kind of solution orientated agenda. So I use the term green squeeze to convey some of the challenges that are faced by exporters. I focused on the coffee value chain in particular, and the challenges that are posed by the rise in unilateral measures to address environmental sustainability in the absence of kind of dedicated support mechanisms for adjustment on the ground. So we've kind of heard the concerns from producers, and those concerns have also been voiced by many members of the G20, South Africa in particular, if we pick up the concerns around the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's consistently raised the point that this is effectively shaping its own climate change mitigation policy. And this is therefore contrary to the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So I think that amongst the G20, there's a strong there are common interests in averting this green squeeze and trying to change some of the dynamics. And I think that the future presidency, as we move to South Africa, we've got this additional kind of dynamic, a new dimension, because of course now the African Union is a permanent member, so it has that voice, the seat at the table, that it just hasn't had before. So this is a really important opportunity. As we know, kind of the G20 always talks about LDCs, least developed countries. These are mostly in Africa, and now the African Union has a seat at that table. So I think it's really is important to consider these dynamics as we move towards a more solution-orientated agenda. So Ambassador Amina has highlighted some of the kind of common interests and entry points that were articulated at MC13, the last WTO ministerial conference. Of course, this communication that was conveyed at the WTO ministerial didn't gain traction amongst all members, but we can see within that submission that South Africa and Brazil are, very much concerned about the green squeeze, but have also put forward a kind of more solution-orientated agenda. So when I look at that document, I can see an emphasis there on technology transfer, on capacity building, and so on. So I would like to see kind of those, I would hope that those areas also gain a lot more traction now onto the presidency of South Africa. The issues around kind of India and how it engages at the WTO on climate issues, I'm not sure, if G20 members can navigate that, but, perhaps if we're moving towards this more solution-orientated agenda and where there are kind of entry points to really gain traction. So I mentioned technology transfer, and of course, kind of just recently, we've seen, quite innovative proposals on technology transfer, talk about potentially a clean energy deal, a green Marshall Plan. This is coming from advisors potentially to the future US president. So this is a real opportunity as we also consider the kind of dynamics, thinking about, when the G20 moves from this kind of Southern Troika in the future to the United States in 2026. So I think it's also about trying to sustain the agenda, to enhance impact. And I think that's something that Fabio also mentioned. So perhaps some kind of assessment on how to overcome some of the challenges of the fact that the G20 doesn't have a dedicated secretariat, and so you can really drive through a kind of more sustained agenda. I'd be hopeful, I really would like to see an emphasis on that. Just to kind of pick up on some of the points regarding investment, I think Fabio raised the points. It's also, implicit within the intervention from Amina and also from Faisal, about investment into the critical minerals, value chains, and so on. But I think South Africa also provides a nice example of, investment in adaptation and building resilience and so on. So I would really like to see those aspects also gaining more traction. And I think, now with the African Union, with a seat at the table, it is this issue of adaptation to climate change that really is the priority, for most countries in Africa, given that their overall contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is negligible. So we've got a real, a big concern on that adaptation front, and we do need new approaches. That focus on technology transfer, that is also related to this adaptation imperative as well. So I would really like to see that kind of priority, really gain traction, also because, in the work that we've done on the green squeeze, it's the interaction really between, the unilateral kind of measures coming downstream to mitigate climate change, interacting with, the fact that producers are trying to adapt to climate change as well. And this is what makes the green squeeze concept so concerning. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jody. Well, the questions are already flowing in, so let's open the discussion. I'll put the questions that have been directed to a particular speaker directly to them, but feel free to jump in and address them. Let's start with a round of 2 or 3, and then we'll see where we get to. So I'll try and summarize. Some are a bit long. So Monique Atoguya from Nature Finance, based in South Africa, highlights in the chat the potential of the bioeconomy for nature-rich countries like South Africa and Brazil, particularly in light of its introduction into the G20 by Brazil. And she expressed concern about avoiding past patterns of value extractions, emphasizing the need for Africa and the so-called Global South to frame the rules to ensure a just transition. So Monique is asking the panelists, but particularly Faisal, for their thoughts on this opportunity. And then we have Awino Kawino, who has done a research around textile mills in Kenya, focusing on a just green growth in textile manufacturing mills, who asks, how can our world trade policy support the just and fair development of our local mills in the midst of second-hand clothes businesses? Perhaps it's one for Amina or others who want to address it. And Ruth Bergen asks, the panel has discussed the green squeeze at a national level. We are particularly aware that small producers are both really feeling the squeeze, but also have very little voice in global processes. And yet they represent most of our world's jobs and a significant proportion of food production. Can the panel see a way to increase the influence of medium and small enterprises, small farmers in shaping trade responses to climate change? Actually, I'll get one last one. I've just noticed. Happy to hear the word CBDR here. Since CBDR is largely ignored by developed powers, how can the so-called developing countries coordinate to create more gravitas around it and bring it to fruition? So Faisal, maybe I'll start with you. It was a question clearly directed to you, and then I'll come to Amina, Fabio, Fernando, Judy for their reflections on the other questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but I think if it is
around the bioeconomy and how if it's in.
Yeah, I mean, what we do have is in Africa, like in Brazil, and to a large extent also in Indonesia and some parts of Asia, we have very significant infrastructure which is nature-based and biodiversity, which are resources that are belong to the world as a whole, and which provide a resource, a service to the whole of humanity. And so what we do need is a global understanding of the value of these resources and the need for a global protection. And so one of the issues that arises about the erosion of biodiversity and its relationship to livelihoods and poverty. And in Africa, we still have several 100 million people who use basic wood and charcoal for fire and to cooking as cooking materials, because they don't have access to energy, to electricity, and other forms of renewable energy. And the only way in which we could reduce this erosion is through providing alternative options. And it is a global responsibility. So there has to be a tax. There has to be a recognition of this resource and a way of providing different options for people who are using biodiversity in a way which results in greater loss to the world. So I don't know what the real answer is. I do know that there are a number of market-based solutions that are being put forward, but a lot of these are suboptimal because we need to look at how the trade in biodiversity and nature-based, say, markets, etc. How does that translate into real value for the communities who are affected by biodiversity loss? So I think there's a big discussion there and a big debate that's still wide open.
Thanks, Faisal. Fabio, you put in the chat the high-level principles adopted last week. Do you want to add anything on this?
No, it's just to highlight that there were lots of expectation around the fact that Brazil has created this initiative that didn't exist before in the G20 Sherpa track on the bioeconomy. And I remember that last year there was lots of discussion on the importance of having a concept or a definition, a common agreed definition of bioeconomy. There were lots of fear of some sort of bioeconomy washing by big enterprises and transnationals. From the result, what I could say is that they were successful in having the high-level principles, but if you go through it, they are quite generic. They talk lots of points that have been discussed in other fora, but not bringing this common definition. So what I think would be important to think on the South Africa is actually, given the importance of this discussion, not only for climate change, but also for biodiversity loss, and the importance of thinking on how we are going to industrialize and protect nature at the same time. I think it's quite important that this issue, if the initiative is not kept, but at least that this priority is kept in other working groups related to it.
And maybe to just add, because I think it's a really important topic, and I'm really happy that Brazil has put it squarely on the table, because it has been a mama during conversations on sustainable development, on the environment, on biodiversity, as Professor Faisal Ismail said. And what has really always struck us, and I think it's because we chose a different path, what has really struck us is that there's so much talk about it, but nobody wants to do anything about it. And so you have what Faisal mentioned about the use of fuel wood in many parts of our countries. And yet there are options, there are alternatives. There's solar. There's gas that can actually be introduced in some of these villages. We have tried to do a bit of that by just making sure that we sell gas to the informal settlements at an affordable, subsidized price to just discourage them from using fuel wood. But that's not something that any country in the South can do on its own. Safeguarding biodiversity is a global responsibility. And because it's a global responsibility, then the answers, the support systems must be globally also created and nurtured. There's no way that you can encourage anybody to go solar if the technology around solar is so expensive and the panels are only meant for the rich and the middle class. So we need to address these things, taking into account all the different contexts that exist, but also the options, the alternatives. How do we make these alternatives attractive enough to make it possible for people to move away from encouraging that loss in biodiversity by cutting down trees that are habitats for birds, for animals, for insects, right, that we actually need to survive. So we will need to just address this in a much more, I think, holistic manner. Addressing just the loss of biodiversity and the cutting down of trees, it doesn't cut it because people have to survive. And the only way they can survive is by ensuring that they have some form of energy to be able to cook their basic food. If you go to that level, even of just the basic needs and the basic demands that these people have to meet on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, there was also a question related from Awino to the textile mills in Kenya and how they can survive given the buoyant secondhand clothes market.
First of all, yes, I think that we have a really, growing textile, manufacturing industry in Kenya, as in many other, countries of the South. Some supported by the existence of AGOA, and the fact that these countries can access a ready US market, but also some of the other preferential, trade arrangements that are in place that allow for these markets to exist. The secondhand clothes, that whole sector, has been a very problematic, sector in relations with other countries, because the secondhand clothes come from mainly developed economies. They don't come from the South; they come from the North. And every time that this issue has been on the table and we've tried to tackle it, what has happened is that measures have then been threatened that would limit our access to some of these markets. And you'll see that many governments then would shy away from, restricting access to secondhand clothes, because they need the access to this market for their finished products, for the commodities, for all that. So it's a conversation that's ongoing. I think personally that it must be resolved at the, regional economic blocks level. Right. So if it's something that is in Kenya, it has to be resolved within the East African market. A country like Rwanda, I think, has already worked really hard on it and has moved, to some extent, restricting the access of secondhand clothes into the Rwandan market. But we need to work together, because just one country doing it doesn't cut it. And we need to come up with answers to some of the questions that are being posed and some of the restrictions that are being threatened, for our products. We are not selling secondhand coffee. We are not selling secondhand tea. We are not selling any secondhand commodities, from the continent. And so I don't think that actually it's fair. And it's just about, fairness, about equity, about social justice, forcing the use of something that has been discarded by one market into the markets of other countries is not something that should be encouraged. That's one. I remember, and I'll say this really, really quickly, I remember that the first time that I ever stepped in a gut meeting, the discussions on baby formula on the table. I don't know whether you remember this, we were both really, really young people, and we walked into these rooms and somebody was discussing the fact that some of this formula was actually, not good for consumption. And we were saying, so they should be also prohibited in our countries, not just in the countries of the North. And I remember one argument from one of my colleagues from the North that said, look, sorry, but the information is out there in the public. You can use it to restrict entry into your market. But I'm not going to close down my, my factories and my, facilities and my markets myself. So if it's not allowed in my country, but there's a ready market out there and it creates jobs in my country, then there's no way that I'm going to close that down. But if you have access to this information, which is public, that this is dangerous, that this is actually poisonous, and close your market to it, we won't have anything. We won't have any problems with it. And I kept thinking, oh my goodness, I mean, it's going to be really difficult for many countries to just be going through pages and pages of the information that's out there on prohibited, products, right? And use that information then to restrict our markets without having any alternatives, in place. And so it's that kind of thing again, that, if something is not good for one market, it should also not be good, for everybody else. And I think that's basically where we should be heading towards.
Thanks, Amina. Let me bring in Jody, because we've actually recently published on this, and we published a report on textile and clothing value chain in Kenya, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. So I'm sure you have something to add to this, Jody.
Yes, thank you very much. I think they're very tricky issues that Ambassador has just raised there, because obviously on an intra-African basis, there are kind of big objectives, including, in relation to textiles and clothing, although they've still got to agree on the rules of origin there. But I think it's those tensions, when you're in a kind of a regional, or expanding the market to develop intra-regional value chains, how then do you deal with kind of essentially unilateral measures that may come, if you're trying to support your industrialization objectives. So I think there are kind of bigger issues there that Ambassadors just flagged. But of course, we know that the EU is trying to restrict and reduce the amount of secondhand clothing that does reach Africa, because of a lot of it is plastic. It's it's synthetic, and it's not even able to be sold on the market because it's actually waste, and it's kind of disguised waste, and this is causing serious problems that have been highlighted for some time. But of course, at the same time, there's still some secondhand clothing there that is sold on the domestic market that does still provide, income, jobs, and so on. So it's a tricky balance there to strike. On the one hand, this push for a more circular economy, the use of kind of natural fibers and so on. This could provide a big boost to Kenya's domestic industry, the textiles industry, but there is a need for kind of support for the development of intra-African, intra-Kenyan value chains. So there's a lot of work to be done in particular on the textile sector. And of course, this textile sector is also affected by climate change as well. So it would be fantastic if that could support and support this drive towards more sustainable consumption, but also in these natural fibers, this sector is also very vulnerable to climate change. So I think it just flags that we need more partnerships, dialogue as well, in order to overcome these challenges. But when you've got these big power asymmetries, capacity constraints, this is very, very challenging to navigate indeed. Just another point on AGOA, because I think Ambassador Amina flagged, you've got the kind of EU measures, you've got US textiles and clothing, the secondhand market as well. And of course, when we haven't yet seen what the US is going to do on this front. So I think looking ahead to AGOA, the future negotiation, like the kind of round two, I think this is really important to look at in the future, trying to get that framework right.
Thanks, Jody. There was also a question on the common but differentiated responsibility on CBDR, and then one on how to increase the influence of small farmers in shaping trade responses to climate change. Fabio, Fernando, I don't know if you want to address either of those or any of the questions that you've heard so far.
Fernando?
Yeah. No, it's appeal to the Paris Agreement.
Fernando, you're breaking up a bit.
National Determinate Commission What? Excuse me.
You were breaking up a bit. Try again.
Can you hear me?
Better.
Okay, thank you. No, the idea is simply that the common but differentiated responsibilities is a pillar of the Paris Agreement and related to the national determined commitments of each country. So I think that there's no way out of taking into consideration when we really try to address the matter of tackling climate change without create problems for continued development of our least developed countries. So especially concerning trade, we see that this principle is not being respected or recognized. It's not being taken in consideration in WTO discussions, and the unilateral measures that are being taken by, for instance, the European Union or the United States. So I think that's a great divergence. The biggest problems we have now to reconcile trade policies and the environmental policies, because countries are more regarded to questions, for example, of national security and the measures of reducing their import dependency. And someone in the Q&A in the chat cited the question of subsidies. That's a problem that we've been discussing for many years in the WTO, reforming the subsidies, especially for the agricultural sector. But now the industrial sector has been an important recipient of many subsidies. So in this kind of measures, in this kind of the discussions, there is any consideration for the common but differentiated responsibility. So it makes also impossible to reconcile trade policy with balanced environmental policy and in such a context. So I think it's crucial that the G20 takes ahead and goes ahead with this issue, and always remember the countries that this is one crucial issue to take into consideration in any policies that are taken and any policies that are being considered from all countries, not only for environmental policies, but industrial policies or any other, even the transfer of technology. These things must be taken in consideration.
Thanks, Fernando. Fabio, there was a question on small producers. We haven't addressed how to bring them into these conversations and really trade negotiations with climate change. Happy to address that.
Yeah, that's also like just taking the points that Fernando just raised on the issue of how technological transfer cooperation, South-South and North-South cooperation, trilateral cooperation to develop low carbon technology that can be taken over by small and medium enterprises. In the big challenge that we have to include micro, small, medium enterprises in trades, it's not only the paperwork that they have to go through, and with the new measures and the new standards, it becomes something very cumbersome for them, and that's something that actually the finance track, not necessarily the trade and investment working group was working with, but the sustainable finance one was looking to it, is how these new regulatory, the ESG measures can put extra costs and then make it even harder for small enterprises to join trade, but also the adoption of the new technologies that are associated with this, because they need to adopt them if they want to join trade, given the unilateral measures that have been taken. And also the changing taste. We cannot ignore that. There is changing taste in the developed countries that also make it harder for them to export. We can have the bioeconomy, we have seen the fair trade initiatives, but that's something that's quite small and doesn't have this developmental impact in most low-income and low-middle-income countries. So that's a challenge, and that's a conversation that we need to take on as T20, discussing trade and investments, but also as G20. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. We got just under 10 minutes. There was one other question that came from Max Mendes-Barra here to ODI. And I think probably this is for you, Faisal, but feel free, all of you, to come in. Max asks, are we hopeful of any significant outcome when the 3 largest G20 members fail to cooperate on critical issues, such as trade of electric vehicles with huge implications for Africa, for instance, the dumping of unsold EVs in Africa? What can South Africa and Africa in general?
Yeah, so Max is asking a big question.
Here, yeah,
it really goes to, because the word dumping has different meanings. One really relates to issues of unfair competition, and the other relates to issues, health and safety. And it seems to me that a number of the issues we've talked about today and which are on the agenda of the G20, they do require us to have the major economies, and Max is right, the major economies, they need to talk about how to address the fundamental questions of geoeconomics. So underneath a lot of the problems we're dealing with in the G20 is rivalry, economic rivalry and competition between the major powers. Ironically, the rivalry is about a global public good. The global public good is about how to save the environment from a disaster which is looming. A climate crisis is looming, and the solutions, the main solutions we are posing to this as a global community is technological change. New technologies to reduce carbon and to address issues of adaptation and resilience. But it is precisely on these new technologies that the big economies of the world are competing, but they're competing in a manner which is disruptive to the world economy, to global governance of our institutions, and which undermines development. That's why we are concerned as African countries and developing countries, because this rivalry is not good for developing countries and particularly for us in Africa. We should collectively be applying our minds to how to build global coherence between the different institutions in the world that are responsible for trade, investment, technology, politics and security. We have to bring these together. So the G20 can do that because they are the leaders, at the summit. They can build this coherence. So whilst we have all these different working groups, and it's that interrelationship and coherence between the different working groups that, where the leaders need to provide global leadership. And so Max's real, question is about competition between the major powers. How do we address? We don't become the victims of this tension between the major powers. And so I think that it's an insightful comment, but it really is about coherence. And that's, I don't know where that is in the G20, but the need for coherence across these different issues, because the trade issues, trade and climate, they can't be resolved in the WTO alone, because we don't trust the WTO because there is a failure of governance by the major countries. The reason for the dispute settlement system being dysfunctional is because the major economies are blocking the appointment of appellate body members. And so you can't have, you have a dysfunctional global trading system. You need that global trading system to solve disputes like the issue of dumping, because that's about unfair trade. And that issue can be brought to a panel in the WTO and can be resolved. But it can't be now because there's no appellate body. So that's my answer.
Brilliant. Well, we've come full circle, really, because Amina started the conversation talking about the importance of coherence, how fundamental that was really to advance an African position in the negotiations and, towards next year's G20, I'd say even, for this year. And that's exactly how you've concluded, Faisal, which is, really a critical element in making progress towards, fairer, more sustainable trade. And I want to thank all of you for such a fascinating, insightful discussion. We've covered a lot of ground. We have talked, really we've heard the complexities of this green trade transition but also explore the potential of the South Africa's G20s to shape a different, sort of course of action. There are a lot of opportunities, as we've heard very clearly, that surround the green transition, but there has to be the political will to pursue them. And, as you've all said, the coherence to negotiate those positions. So I think as South Africa assumes the G20 chair, the potential to reshape this agenda is significant. But to achieve that, I think it's also very clear that we need this collaboration. We need a focus on, sustainable development, and we really think, need all sort of partners, people to come together to push, the course of action. I hope today's conversation has inspired all of you to think critically about, these challenges and opportunities. I'd just like to again really thank Faisal, Amina, Fabio, Fernando, and Jody for engaging in such an important and interesting discussion. The webinar concludes here, but the conversation must continue. So I think we really should try and keep the momentum that we're generating today, work together to advance a green trade transition that is both sustainable and just. Thank you once again, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you all. Thank you.